Hello and happy first day of Starlight, my dear page viewers. This month we're kicking things back a little bit, being a little bit less formal, and I'm giving you 12 video series that is about various topics related to Final Fantasy and Friends, and all that good jazz. So, today I'm going to take you down a little tour of the back lore of Final Fantasy VIII, from start to right up until the game begins. But first, I want to do my daily Starlight shoutout, and today's is Norse myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII by none other than M.J. Gallagher. Go ahead and pick that book up, by the way. I have read through it a couple of times now. It is fantastic. It is an absolute breakdown of Norse mythology and Final Fantasy VII, the entire compilation. There's nods in there everywhere. It is a must-have this holiday season, and there is still time to get it on Amazon or Amazon.co.uk or Goodreads. So please, definitely, if you have not had the chance yet to get these up, pick up this book today. There will be links in the description. Anyways, enough of this nonsense. On to the reason you came here. So, for starters, I break down the timeline into three major eras: before Centra, or BC, the Centran era, CE, and after Centra, AC. Now, most of the game's background events take place after Centra, but so much of the lore upon which that is based takes place in the two other eras. Now, while my personal timeline has some non-canonical entries for headcanon's sake, I'm going to be sticking as best as possible to only canon lore. So, let's start at the beginning. It all starts with the ascension of the Great Hein, which takes place a considerable amount of time before the formation of Centra. I set it at about 1000 BC just for argument's sake. We hear the story a couple of times throughout the game. First, a capsule version from an old man talking to his grandson in Balam Town, which goes like this. Long, long ago, when this world was just made, there was a strong god called Hein. This god was very, very strong, but after fighting a lot of monsters, he became very tired. So he made people like you and me to do all the work, and the god went to sleep. However, the god was very surprised when he awoke, surprised that there were so many people. Hein decided to reduce the number of people by taking away the children. Of course, everyone was scared then too, and so the battle against Hein began. Even though the people were small, they all got together and finally cornered him. Hein didn't know what to do. Out of desperation, he gave half of his body to the people and ran off with the remaining other half. Well, he was a god. Anyway, it turns out Hein tricked the people. The half that Hein ran away with was the half that had the stronger magic. That's a decent summation, but the legend of Vaskaroon provides a bit better detail. Most of the same details are there, although it never actually refers to him as a god, but rather a person, perhaps an atheistic account to this legend. The key difference comes from the second half of this book. A white seed will read this out to us on Adia's ship. Eventually, Hein began to lose the war because there were too many people to fight, and they were getting smarter. Therefore, he decided to make peace with people by offering them half of his body along with his powers. Hein cut his body in half and gave the people half as he promised. Then, another war started. People began to fight over the power Hein offered them through his body. This war lasted decades. Finally, King Zabalga and the Zabalga tribe emerged victorious and demanded Hein's body half to get its powers. But the body ignored their commands. Then Vaskaroon came to the rescue. He appeared before the confused Zabalgas and revealed to them that Hein's body half was corrupt and possessed no real power. The body half was actually Hein's cast-off skin. The Zabalgas were angered by this truth and decided to destroy Hein. The Zabalgas never found Hein. People began to call him Hein the Magician, and continued to hunt him for centuries to come. There is one other account, though we don't get it in-game. Here we go. Aruhi no Garden no Jugyo Fukei is a short story by Kashichige Nojima, included in the Ultimania. It is of a Balam Garden teacher telling his class about sorceresses and Hein. This has been recently translated by thelifestream.net, and you can find it on the FF Wiki, so give it a read. This version adds some interesting details, such as describing Vascaroon as a sage and explaining the reason Hein created the tools in the first place. A mountain obstructed his view of the Eastern Sea, and he wanted it gone. It's also far less ambiguous in its description of Hein, saying in no uncertain terms that Hein created the world. Now, whether or not this story actually happened as detailed within these legends, remember, legend implies at least a somewhat unreliable narrator, or is a metaphor for human discovery of magic and sorceresses is ultimately up to your discretion. I think we can at least infer that Hein, Vascaroon, and Zabalga did literally exist, and I think the story is more or less accurate as described. It gives us a clear lineage of sorceress power, as Hein's missing other half planted itself into certain women. We can also surmise that when a sorceress passes on her powers, she is passing on a part of Hein. This leads me down my massive rabbit hole headcanon theory about how Ultimisia's plan to compress time is actually Hein using his will and power to both finally win the war against humans and to reassemble his missing body, but that's not canon yet, so we're moving on. The tale of Zephyr we first get a glimpse of in-game during a Laguna dream sequence. It's the one with the movie and the unreasonably catchy song. Now, while we don't know too many specifics, we get a lot of important information. I think the tale predates Sentra by a little bit, but I don't really have any hard evidence on that. What we do know is that Zephyr was a sorceress knight of a sorceress who was trying to stand up for the people of a collapsed country in, quote, ancient times. Not a lot to go on, but there's more. These events probably did actually happen and were not just the invention of the story, but the book came first and was later made into a movie. We know that Cypher has seen that movie because he uses the exact same stance as Laguna, and it's his romantic dream to be a sorceress knight. Most crucial of all, though it might not seem like it, is that gunblades are ancient technology. I mean, predating Sentra ancient. Assuming Zephyr did indeed use a gunblade, and that is not just an invention of the film, gunblades are as much a part of this world as axes and swords. Okay, so, the formation of Sentra. We know the world was scattered into tribes after the war between the humans over Hein's skin. We also know that Sentra became basically the center of human civilization for most of the game world's history. Presumably, there was a great gathering at some point and a lot of handshaking, and the first major human empire was formed, Sentra. This leads us down some massive lore diversions, so follow along with me, why don't you? But a bit about Sentra first. First off, we can assume that based on their ruins, that they held the sorceresses in high regard, whether worshipping or fearing them. All the legends we learn about likely originated in Sentra as retellings of their history. And as far as technology, well, Estar only became the most technologically advanced civilization after Sentra's collapse, which was just over 100 years before the game began. I know at one point it's described as 80 years before the game began, but two other in-game sources and the Ultimania confirm that it's over 100. So it turns out when you cram all of human civilization into one continent, things get a little cozy. Fortunately, Sentra manufactured giant floating mobile shelters, which we would later recognize as the Gardens. Clarification here, it's indicated that several of these were made throughout history, so many in fact that a prominent Guardian force is modeled after one. I'm talking about Eden here. But the only three that survive to date are the three in-game. Back to the point, these people ended up sending out shelters in two directions to form the civilizations of Dole and Estar. The people of Estar were mainly concerned with technology and learning new ways to help their budding nation flourish. The people of Dole were mostly warlike, which I'm certain won't affect the history of the world in any way. Okay, so listen, the history of the Holy Dole Empire is tricky. It's described as having ruled most of the world at one point, which we already ascertained Centra kinda did, and given the nod to the Roman Empire in Centra and Dole, specifically the Holy Dole Empire, is literally named after the Holy Roman Empire, my theory is that these warlike people ended up rebelling against Centra. They had themselves a grand little revolution and said they'll start their own nation, with Triple Triad and Geezers. So in effect, while Centra was in decline, Dole was on the rise, and when they ran out of Centrans to fight against, they started fighting with each other, splintering into the three nations of Galbadia, Timber, and the Dole Dukedom, which is sadly but a pale shadow of its former glory. Now, during the time of the Holy Dole Empire, Balam sprung up as a coastal fishing town, but all we really know about that is that it used to be part of the HTE and is now autonomous. I seem to recall a story about fishermen looking for a particular island, but I can't find a canon source for that anywhere, so it may have been my own invention. If you know what I'm talking about, just let me know. Instead, I'll tell you some side lore that I think is cool. This town is known for two major varieties of fish. The Balam fish, for which the town is named, and it's so tasty it is listed as one of the world's 3 great delicacies, the second being the wind cacti of western Galbadia, or the West Desert cacti, and the third remains unnamed, unfortunately. But there is also the Badam fish, or Badam fish, which isn't exactly poisonous, but if it's cooked wrong, it'll really make the eater sick to their stomach, which is what happens to Raijin during the occupation of Balam, funny enough. And apparently, these two fish look very similar. Fun. Okay, so fun time is over. Centra collapses about 100 years before the game begins, and we all know how that happens. Say it with me, the Lunar Cry. Now, the Lunar Cry is a natural phenomenon, which occurs regularly since the dawn of the world. It's explicitly stated in the Ultimania that this cycle is tens of thousands of years old, like the tides. But the Lunar Cry that destroyed Centra was so massive and so devastating that it sent down the moon's crystal pillar with it, which would later be used to make the lunatic Pandora. The fact that the crystal pillar is on the planet now makes a Lunar Cry something of an inevitability, and it sped up the cycle dramatically. And of course, we all know how that turned out. But yeah, that's it for Centra, and with its utter destruction, the world map is basically set for the game, but there are a few pieces of lore that I just want to go over to wrap things up. So let's take a look at the after Centra period. So, magic exists naturally within the sorceresses, but if you're not a sorceress, your magical options are pretty much non-existent, at this point in history anyway. It appears that the Centra may have developed a type of magitech, which would explain all the cool mystical gadgets in their ruins, but that's neither here nor there. Dr. Odin, fortunately, is here to save us. He studied the Guardian forces and the process of junctioning, and using that knowledge of extracting magic, drawing, he developed paramagic. And he got a little help from sorceress Idea, no less. Now this was pre-possession Idea, mind you. Problem was that Estar at this time was under the hand of sorceress Adele. Which leads us to... yes, the Sorceress War. Now we learn about most of the events in-game, but I'll sum up anyways. Galbadia was at war with Timber for a while, during the tail end of which, for good measure, Estar declared war on Galbadia. Sorceress Adele was looking for a child to pass her powers onto, which led to Elone being kidnapped. Now Laguna went off to save Elone and accidentally became a hero of the revolution, and came up with the ingenious strategy of fail to trick Adele, then shove her. Estar is freed, Laguna takes control of Estar, and ends the war with Galbadia by enacting a strict policy of isolationism, which has been in effect for 17 years. And there was just one problem. When they launched Adele into space for safekeeping, her tomb ended up creating radio interference across the entire planet, plunging the world into a communications blackout. Pre-recorded broadcasts using Galbadia-developed HD cable line, and presumably an Astarian equivalent, is possible, as are very short-range burst transmissions, but satellite communication stops completely until a certain fateful seed exam ended with the Dole Communications Tower going live again, which we can presume was Sorceress Ultimisia's doing. And everything else you pretty much know from the game. The gardens are founded by Norg and Cid. Cid is designed to fight the sorceress. I don't need to rehash the game's events for you, but I wanted to kind of give a total summary of the game's backstory, and I hope I did it justice. If I got anything wrong, please let me know in the comments. I can only learn if people correct me. Thank you for listening to me ramble on for you for about 20 minutes now, geez. And I'll see you in the next one.